All eyes are on Israel after it launched an airstrike in Rafah that killed at least 45 people, many of whom were women and children. Now, as international condemnation grows, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the strike that did kill two senior Hamas officials a, quote, tragic error, but he said that he would not end the war until their military goals were, in fact, accomplished. But are Israelis supportive of what leadership has been doing? Here to discuss what it's like on the ground in Israel is The Hill's foreign policy reporter, Laura Kelly. Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a moment that has provoked considerable international condemnation, including I saw from Emmanuel Macron, the leader of France. But what is it like in Israel? The people there, we've understood thus far that, even if there is frustration or opposition to Netanyahu himself, there seems to be tremendous support among Israelis for continuing the war effort. Is that changing, or is that true? What can you tell us?
Thanks. I've been in Israel now almost a week and a half, but I've reported from this region over the course of the past 10 years or so. And it's a really different environment now than I've experienced in previous times. Before this strike on Rafah, I was observing already deep divisions in Israeli society. But most important, that there is still support for the war. So there is support among Israeli society by and large for the two main priorities, which is to kind of eliminate the threat from Hamas and bring the hostages home. But this Rafah strike, which again, the Israeli Defense Forces and Netanyahu said was targeting two Hamas senior officials, but that tragically ignited a fire in this displaced persons camp, I think is bringing some of the divisions even more to the fore. We see protests starting to come out in Israel against the Israeli military operation in Gaza. These are pretty small protests. There was one taking place at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem today, described as dozens of people. And there was a protest in the Israeli city of Haifa. It's a mixed Jewish and Arab, Muslim, Christian city. Still about 100 people came out to protest Israel's military operation in Gaza. But there's wide division for Israelis that want to see a negotiated settlement, bring the hostages home. They want the government to do more to reach a ceasefire with Hamas to secure the release of the hostages. And then there's a segment of the Israeli society that wants the military operation to just go as hard as it can. So that's what I'm observing so far.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the role that hostages are playing in the public's discontent with Benjamin Netanyahu? You alluded to the idea that some of the protests are about people who are wanting to prioritize bringing hostages home and who don't see Netanyahu as pursuing that effort. What's been going on? What have people been saying? How was the news received of three deceased hostages being recovered last week received? And does that make any difference in terms of whether or not people are looking at Netanyahu as someone who's really prioritizing getting hostages returned?
Yes, there's a tension in Israeli society over what is the best strategy to return the hostages. Netanyahu believes that a tough military operation is the best way to put pressure on the head of Hamas in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, to come to the table to agree to some type of agreement, ceasefire, release of hostages that would have better terms for the Israelis if Sinwar is under extreme pressure in Gaza. And there's a segment of Israeli society that believes that the military operation and the military pressure should come first. And then there's a segment of Israeli society, I think largely the families of hostages held by Hamas, that say, no, more must be done to reach a diplomatic settlement. And on top of this is just a lot of trauma over how many hostages are believed to be alive or deceased. There's about 125 hostages that are believed to be still held by Hamas. But as the recovery of these three bodies has shown, there was an estimate that about 39 of the hostages were dead. So then this brings the number to about 36 bodies that Hamas might be holding, but I've heard some estimates that that there's a belief that less than half the hostages are alive. So this would be around less than 63 are alive. So there's a lot of trauma.
Does the war feel real from where you are? Is this something that's happening, in a region separate away? Is there an understanding among Israelis that there's a war going on?
The feeling that I can best explain what's happening in Israel, I think for the majority of society, is that it is still October 7th, and it is day maybe 235 of the war. I have to double check on that. But the reason that I know that it's at least more than 230 days is because for the families of hostages, they write the number of days on little pieces of duct tape and they put that on their shirt every day. And one of the families of the hostages, the father of Omer Nutra, he said that counting the days keeps them connected to reality because they still feel like they're in October 7th. And a lot of society, I think, feels like they're in October 7th because this war is continuing and there's more tragedy every day with the war. People can't resume their lives. People can't begin to resolve the trauma, deal with the trauma because they can't go home to their communities. They're still worried about their families. There's about more than 100,000 or so displaced persons within Israel because the communities in the south are still devastated from the October 7th terrorist attack, but also cannot rebuild because of the continued rocket attacks, mortars, different things being fired from the Gaza Strip. It's less now because of the Israeli military operations to dismantle Hamas, but it's still present. And there's an exchange of fire nearly every day on the Israel's border with Lebanon against Hezbollah. About 60,000 people from Israel's communities in the north have been displaced. So they're living in communities around Israel. So they can't go back home. And this is having an enormous toll on the whole country. So it's every day dealing with the repercussions of October 7th and feeling like that day just never ended. So definitely there's a sense of the war. And of course, I mean, nearly everyone has somebody that is serving in the military. Reservists have been on call in rotations for months. So yeah, there's definitely a sense. And again, this understanding of what's happening in Gaza on the Palestinian side, there's divisions over who's paying attention to that or not. And we saw with some of these protests in relation to the strike that hit the displaced persons camp in Rafah, that there's momentum to try and bring that kind of tragedy to the forefront.
The Times of Israel reported last week that only 3 hostages have been recovered by the IDF alive. The bodies of 19 hostages have also been recovered, and there were the 3 hostages that were mistakenly killed by the IDF as well. How is the public perceiving the job Netanyahu is doing and actually getting people home as compared to what has been described as an effort to prioritize keeping the war going to protect himself politically? To what extent does his kind of political vulnerability, is that seen as playing a role in how he's conducting this siege in Gaza?
It seems that generally Netanyahu is in a strong position for where he is, even though there is this kind of dissension in Israeli society pushing for more efforts to be made over diplomatic negotiations to secure the release of the hostages. Probably more support is for Netanyahu to continue the Israeli military operation because among Israeli society, there's a fear that if there's a ceasefire, whether it's 6 to 8 weeks or however long it could be, this would give Hamas the ability to regroup and further threaten Israel more. So there's a little bit more support for continuing the military operation to put pressure on Hamas to release the hostages and also these kind of efforts to recover hostages on their own. And we've seen some kind of opposition from Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. He's a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, but he's not criticizing the prime minister over the hostages. He's criticizing the prime minister for failing to lay out a vision for the day after a defeat of Hamas in Gaza. And similar with Benny Gantz, who's a member of the Unity Wartime Cabinet, he's critical of Netanyahu for not laying out this vision. So really they want to see Netanyahu move beyond just saying, okay, pressure, get the hostages. Well, what's going to happen when we finally defeat Hamas? What kind of hope are you going to give to Israelis that they're going to be secure?
Laura Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.